From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris with you on this Wednesday. It's good to be back. It was off the last couple of days, so this is a live program. So as always with this program, we invite you to join in the conversation if you'd like. The phone lines will be open, but if you just want to sit back and talk or listen, that's fine. The topic today is something we've touched on with different aspects. We all know Middle Tennessee especially, but Tennessee, I mean, it is a very hot market. It's growing. We've talked about real estate. We've talked about all of the different companies that have moved here, the jobs that are available, things that are happening here. It's boomtown. But in general, a lot of various communities, not just here in Tennessee, but across the country, have seen some radical changes that have come out of the past 2 years of this pandemic. And what it means, migration. Folks may be deciding to stay home and work, okay? They have that option. They don't have to live somewhere. So you have people moving or staying home. You have, the housing situation, the traffic patterns. All of these types of things have changed and been altered, some for the better, some for the worse, and how it affects us all here. We're going to kind of get into all of that and what it means and maybe where we're going from here, hopefully, as we continue to emerge from the pandemic, and see if some of these changes are permanent or if maybe they'll go back to the way they were. And I think it's fair to say that things in large measure have changed permanently for a lot because people have discovered new ways of doing things. The number 737-7587, but kind of to talk about this phenomenon and kind of put it down where how it affects you and I, joined with by a finance professor from Vanderbilt University. Peter Haslag is with us this morning. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You look like a young Russell Crowe. Have you ever been told that?
I have not been told that.
Okay, well, you're no gladiator. You're a professor.
No, I don't have the muscles.
It's good to have you on. And I'm trying. It's kind of I was trying, as I was describing it to our viewers just now, it's abstract, trying to say, okay, now where are we going to focus here? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Maybe as a professor and what you teach in finance, kind of set this up for us. The idea of migration and what kind of things do you think were most significant that came change-wise during the pandemic?
Sure. So, migration is important because when people are moving, they're carrying their resources. They're going to consume locally, so they're going to be putting money into the economy, the local economy. So, we generally just tend to care about it. And so when the pandemic hit, a lot of things happened. I think two of the biggest things that happened is first we had a lot of people able to do remote work, and as they were able to shift to remote work, that allowed them the flexibility. So if you can detach the job location from where you want to live, then you have a lot more flexibility. So we saw people reassorting because of that. And then the other thing is the family dynamics really changed a lot. A lot more people in the house, a lot more of the time, and so people wanted space or other things because of the pandemic might have changed their family situation in terms of schooling or restrictions, and so people were kind of just rooting out to figure out what's the best way to make the most of the situation.
All right, so I'm thinking the first point you made about folks staying at home, it sounds to me like Manhattan, New York.
Yeah. Okay,
took it on the chin, okay, because for a long time, you had to work in Madison Avenue, you were there in Manhattan. You had to work very expensive properties, and all of a sudden, these companies are realizing, gosh, we can use Zoom and we can do this from home, and we don't need to pay that bazillion dollars. And so, what I've heard is like for the first time in years, rent, where they have rent control, rent has gone down maybe in Manhattan.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a place maybe where it's affected, where people have left. How did it affect us, would you say, here, especially specifically in Middle Tennessee, Southern Kentucky?
Yeah, so Middle Tennessee saw a huge amount of growth. Even before the pandemic, there was a huge amount of growth.
Right, people were just coming, like I was saying.
And the pandemic really just exacerbated that. So within like the top 10 counties in the U.S. who saw a change in their migration, so we're comparing migration before to migration after, we saw that 3 of those counties were in Tennessee, with Davidson being one of the top 10. So they've seen an enormous amount of growth. That obviously puts pressure on the system and the infrastructure. Luckily, with the pandemic, there was less people traveling, so we haven't had to really experience a lot of it. But we've seen the house price growth that we've seen across the country, but primarily here.
Well, why then? Okay, so we kind of explained maybe why they left Manhattan, because you don't have to pay that rent anymore. What was it then, especially during the pandemic, that you think has brought people to Tennessee?
Yeah, so in our research, what we were doing was comparing like where people left to where they went. And so like what you could do is look at what is the rent differential between Tennessee, and then ask what is the probability that more people move there. And so what we found is that lower tax locales, which Tennessee would be one of those, lower cost of living, so relative to some of these more expensive areas, Chicago, New York,
Los Angeles, right?
We saw places with less restrictions. So again, that kind of New York to Tennessee move starts to make a little more sense. Tennessee to Florida was also New York to Florida,
right,
was also.
Oh, so you mean maybe some of the states, like Tennessee was one probably, that didn't have as many of the COVID restrictions,
right?
Especially when it came to schooling. So these are maybe families with children that weren't in a position to be able to stay home with their kids, and they really wanted them to feel safe at school but go to school.
Right, absolutely. And so one of the interesting things, at least to me, was that we saw one of the biggest groups affected by the pandemic were mid-career individuals with families.
So folks, would you say what, 30s, 40s?
Yeah, so 30 to kind of 50, it was that range.
Right.
More than 1 or 2 kids. So these are the people that are kind of like most likely not to leave because they're stuck.
That's what I was going to say. You're established. The most likely to leave would be maybe a young single individual,
exactly.
right? That doesn't have kids, doesn't have anything tying them down, and they're pursuing their career.
Exactly. And so the pandemic hit, and we actually saw a rise in these moves. And so
the ones who were less likely.
Yes, exactly. And so where they move is more indicative of perhaps where they'll stay, because for the first time they had the flexibility to go where they wanted to go, or to reassess what was important to them.
And it's still a more difficult move because you're moving a whole family. So when you get a place that you like, their folks, unlike maybe a young entrepreneur that just bounces around, they're going to stay once they get here.
Right. They're going to invest more. As opposed
to this is a pit stop now.
Yeah, exactly.
So people have come here, all right, for that. And so the impacts on that, as you've said, and it was happening before they all started coming, is traffic.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to build it out. You have to have more schools to accommodate. There's an anecdote that I tell about a place in Utah where they had this growth. Utah is one of the places that also saw growth in the Mountain West, and they had so much growth that their children only went to school a few days a week because they had to rotate because the school couldn't hold the capacity.
Because and is that because so many people moved there and they haven't built new
families
schools yet?
Yeah, exactly, because it takes time to build up the infrastructure.
What was it about Utah? I'm just curious. Was it similar things to here? Or
yeah.
What?
Yeah. So restrictions, taxes. A lot of people did move to areas where they could enjoy recreational activities. So you think about the pandemic. We're stuck inside. What are we going to do? Well, here's an opportunity to perhaps get out and move to a place where we can be outdoors and be quote unquote safe.
All right. Now, inversely, there are other areas that a lot of people just seem to assume that people are just leaving California and moving here to Tennessee because it's so great. And there are plenty of people leaving. And I live in California. You can bash it all you want. California, in a lot of ways, is a great place to live. And number one for me is surfing and the beach. And you don't got that here in Tennessee, and I miss it every darn day. But there are a lot of great things about living here. But it's a misnomer to say that, California is going to be vacant. People are moving there as quickly as they're leaving.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is like a repositioning. So people are moving out of urban centers, out to the suburbs a little bit more. People are moving to some other areas. So I think the middle of California saw a huge amount of growth.
Okay.
And so San Francisco is definitely one that experienced a lot of outflow of people, but LA still had some inflows. It's teetering on growth or decline, but it's interesting to watch, and I totally agree. California and both New York, it's not to say that people aren't going to move there. Eventually prices adjust.
Right.
And so if it becomes cheaper, then everything that you weren't willing to pay for, you might be willing to pay for.
If you can get yourself a good deal on a Manhattan apartment, I would love to live in downtown New York. I could never afford something like that, but we'll take a break. When we come back, I guess I want to touch bases a bit on the whole concept of maybe now folks, and New York is the prime example, but maybe even here, and if you think it's true for Nashville, as we see all this construction in the city, but that people are maybe moving more to the suburbs to some degree, or the outer lying areas, and what impact that has on the cities themselves, and if that's going to happen more here in Nashville, where we have all this building going on. I personally think there's going to be a little bubble that's going to bite people in the butt at one point on these real estate values. We'll take a break, be back with more with the professor, and we can take a few calls if you have observations or thoughts about this, on what you see about some of your new neighbors here that's really changed. We'll be back right after this.